So in the last section, we put together a little application in CodePen. And when you click on the button, you get this gray button. So now the app looks pretty simple, but at the same time, we had some pretty complicated syntax. So I'm sure at this point, you might have a couple of questions about, well, what we put together. So in this video, I want to start to address a couple of these questions that I think you might have. What is React and what's its purpose? What was that class thing? What was that HTML looking stuff? Now, why did we add React and React DOM libraries? How did the color change when we clicked on the button? So let's start by answering these questions now, and we will be answering more in the next coming lectures. So, first off, what the heck is React and what's its purpose? What do we use this library for? Okay, so React by itself is a single JavaScript library. So the goal of React is to produce some useful content that is going to show up on the screen of your user's browser. Now, when we say content, what we're really talking about here is the HTML. So the same type of HTML that you've probably learned, right, by this point. So divs, spans, buttons, forms, headers, and all those classic HTML elements are going to be produced by the React library. And then they're going to show up on the screen of your user's browser. So once those elements show up on the screen, a user's going to somehow interact with them, right? They might click on a button. They might type some input into text input, or they might drag and drop some div or something else around on the screen. Okay? Cool. So the second goal of React is to handle those user interactions. So anytime that a user manipulates our app in some fashion, we're going to want to respond to that in some way. All right, so now we'll talk a lot more about what React is and what its purpose is over time. It'll like gradually dawn on you or sink in or whatever. But now, right now, this definition will suffice. All right? So let's move on to our next question. Yes, you in the back. Just playing. So the next question is, what was that class thing that we put together? Now, if you notice, back over here in the JavaScript editor, line 1, we had this class app extends react.component. All right, you with me? So that syntax we saw there is a JavaScript class. JavaScript classes are just part of what is referred to as ES 2015. Now, if you're not familiar with JavaScript classes, arrow functions, or class properties, that's totally fine. We're going to talk about all of these pieces of ES 2015 syntax throughout the course, so you're going to be an expert. Now, the class itself was creating something called a React component. So a component is one of the most basic pieces of React, and in this course, we're going to build a tremendous amount of different components. The ultimate goal of a single component, though, is essentially the goal of the React library itself. What do I mean by that? Well, a single component is going to be used to create some amount of HTML that shows up on the screen. We can write and create React components using either JavaScript classes, which is what we just used, or JavaScript functions, pretty much the same functions that you're probably used to putting together. Now, we'll talk about the difference between JavaScript functions and classes being used for components all the time, so I don't really need to go into much detail now. You'll get it. So for now, let's just move on to the next question. What do you think? Next question was, what was that HTML-looking stuff? So back inside of the editor over here, you'll notice that inside of that render method, we had what, sure enough, looks like a little bit of HTML right here. So, in fact, it's not quite HTML, even though it looks very much like HTML. Instead, what we wrote there was something called JSX. So, JSX is a special dialect of JavaScript. Remember, it is a language that essentially allows us to tell a React component how it and what it should look like when it's rendered and shows up on the screen of the browser. So it's that JSX used to determine the content of our React application, just like, well, normal HTML does. So in general, if you're familiar with HTML, you're going to do just fine with JSX. All of the syntax is almost identical. Okay, I say almost, but we're going to come across some of the details, and I'll point them out when we get there. JSX is, you're going to learn a bit more, and you're going to find out exactly what JSX is. But for now, again, that's enough. Okay, so what's the next question? Oh, yeah, so why did we have to add two separate libraries? Now, remember when we went through that initial setup, we clicked on the settings button up here? We then clicked on JavaScript and we added two separate libraries. So one was called React and the other one was called React DOM. Okay, so I caught you up. The React library by itself contains a ton of JavaScript code that defines what a component is and how different components work together. In typical React applications, we're going to end up making multiple different components and somehow getting them to join up together to form an actual usable application. The React library itself is in charge of making that entire process work. Now, on the other hand, the React DOM library contains a certain amount of JavaScript code that will take that collection of components and eventually get them to show up inside of the DOM or get them to show up as some type of HTML. Okay, so that's why we added two separate libraries. All right, now what's the last question? Do you remember? Oh, right. So how did the color change when we clicked on the button? Well, now remember, the kind of running theme here is that we want to make use of React to handle user interaction. So as we just spoke about with components just a second ago, we spoke about components over here. Now, we said that a component is used to present some content on the screen, right? We can also use a component to create something called an event handler. Event handlers are used to somehow detect when a user is interacting with our app by clicking or dragging or typing or whatever it might be. We can then use that event handler to somehow update our application or update our component, right? And then show some slightly different content on the screen. So we're going to write a tremendous amount of event handlers throughout this course. So I don't want to bore you with any more explanations. Because this is really one of the main goals of the React library, is responding to user interaction. All right, so that's a couple of questions answered. There's a whole lot of meat in there. You might want to digest that for a little while. And for my vegetarian friends, yeah, there's a lot to digest there. So why don't you go over it, pause it right here, and review some of that material. When you come back, we're going to go to the next section and start learning more about React.